Good storytellers always bring their plot points together in a climactic hit. No matter what book you're reading, a good book will inevitably bring what seems like different, unrelated characters and ideas together before the book is over. Uh, what can seem like a bunch of separate stories are effectively woven together by good writers into a single unified story that is, sometimes really hard to understand until you get to that ending. You can feel like I have no idea why I'm following this character and this storyline. It's like a B plot or a C plot or something. Give me back to the A plot. And then you get to the end of the A plot and you've collectively woven in a B and C character and their plots into your A plot narrative. It all comes together in the end. Well, Genesis 11, 1 through 9, known as the Tower of Babel, is the third and final climactic rebellion of human and celestials against God that sets the stage for the rest of the Bible. So in this story, the author is taking previously woven plot points that we've already talked about from Genesis 1 through 10, and he's subtly going to weave them into this narrative and bring them together in a final climactic end to this prologue. So it's going to take us some time to unravel this, but today we're going to introduce the human side and the human decisions around this event. And if we fail to connect the dots of these previous stories together into this final story, we will fail to understand the gravity of the Tower of Babel incident, the entire prologue of Genesis, and what the rest of the Bible is actually trying to undo in these three rebellions. Because most people only ever focus on the first rebellion in Genesis 3. They don't read Genesis 6 and Genesis 11, 1 through 9, the Tower of Babel, as a second and third rebellion between celestial and terrestrial beings against God. We want to bring these things together because the author is bringing them together, which brings me to this point, or this question, really. How is the story of Babel typically taught? What have you heard in your short lifetimes about the Tower of Babel? Generally, the ideas tend to be something like this. Man is trying to work his way or build his way to God, to heaven, something like that. But he always fails to somehow get to God, right? This is a pretty typical modern interpretation of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel typically gets caught. Man's trying to achieve something and get himself to God. That is not what the Tower of Babel story is about at all. Man is not trying to get to God. He just isn't. The ancient Near Eastern reader knew humanity was not trying to get to heaven or get to God by building a structure. Rather, by building a physical structure, humanity was trying to compel the gods to come down to them. And once they were with humans, they wanted the gods' help to rebuild their own kingdom on the earth. We're going to talk about what idea and what kingdom they're trying to rebuild here, but that's what they're trying to do. We want to partner with the gods and bring the gods down to us, and we want to build our kingdom here. And so we, as modern readers, we flip the story upside down from the actual intention that's going on here. In Genesis 11, 1 through 9, the Tower of Babel is about trying to build a kingdom on earth by partnering with the gods, as already happened in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, an action that caused God to destroy the whole world. The tower will be designed not to get to the gods' domain, but to bring the gods down to the domain of men, so that human society can flourish. But ultimately, it will become the opposite of what God would want, so God stops it. Now we're going to watch a video from the Bible Project, and what I've done here is I've blended 2 or 3 different videos about different celestial beings, including angels, demons, and their rebellions, and I blended them into one of about 6.5 minutes here to focus on the Tower of Babel, but ultimately push us forward where we're going with Jesus. So this is going to kind of summarize where we're going for probably the next 2 to 3 weeks. and not just what we're going to talk about tonight.
The God of the Bible wants to share authority with others.
Oh, right. God shares his rule with human partners on earth. And so, in the same way, there's a parallel story of God sharing his authority to rule with spiritual partners.
Yes, that is, until it all falls apart in a twin rebellion. So you have humans who want to rule on earth on their own terms. So they start building their own nation using their own definitions of good and evil.
Yeah, the famous story of the building of Babylon.
But check this out. When biblical authors like Moses or Isaiah looked back at the origins of Babylon, they saw more than just a human rebellion, but also a spiritual rebellion.
What was this spiritual rebellion?
Okay, so remember the concept of God's heavenly staff team, the divine council, or the sons of God. In the Hebrew scriptures, we're told that some of these rebelled too.
When did that happen?
Multiple times, actually. After the snake comes the rebellion of the sons of God in Genesis 6. We're told that they have sex with women who then give birth to violent warrior giants.
Oh, right. The Nephilim. These are probably the strangest characters in the whole Bible.
Well, strange from your point of view, but ancient readers knew exactly what was going on. The ancient kingdoms around Israel claimed to be founded and protected by giant warrior kings who were part human, part God, and filled with divine wisdom.
Ah, I see. So the biblical authors are saying, hey, those warrior kings, they shouldn't be honored.
Right. In this story, they're portrayed as human rebels who are captive to spiritual evil, spreading their violence in God's good world.
Yeah, and one of those kings in Genesis 10 goes on to build the city of Babylon.
Yes, Nimrod, whose name sounds like the Hebrew word for rebel. And his kingdom leads to the next rebellion, where humans exalt themselves in Babylon.
But God scatters that rebellion.
And when Moses in Deuteronomy looks back at that story, he says that's the moment when God handed over the nations to worship the rebel host of heaven, the gods of money, sex, and military power. Moses is the first one to call them demons, that is, lesser spiritual beings. There were members of the divine council who, like the humans, didn't want to represent God's authority anymore. They wanted to be God, and they rebelled. And so these created beings deceived humans into worshiping them instead of the Creator. And so Babylon becomes the biblical image for the combined human and spiritual rebellion.
And so God scatters the people from Babylon into different nations.
And in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says this is when God also scattered the rebels of the divine council with them.
So the nations are handed over to spiritual rulers.
Yes, and this is why when the biblical prophets look out at the violent empires of their day, they see two dimensions to all the chaos and injustice. Human rebels who are being corrupted by the worship of spiritual rebels, the idol gods of money, sex, and military power.
Yeah, when humans give their allegiance to these powers, it leads to a world like ours.
Right, and the best example of this is the story of the Exodus, where we're told that the Egyptian genocide of the Israelites was inspired by Pharaoh and by the gods of Egypt.
That's really intense.
But it's not the end of the story. When God rescued the Israelites from Egypt and its gods, he invited them to become his covenant partners and learn a different way of ruling the world.
And they agree to it, but in the end they don't honor the partnership. They give their allegiance to other gods.
And so this leads to their exile in Babylon, where they become slaves once again to a foreign nation and their spiritual rulers, awaiting a new exodus into freedom. And this is where the story of Jesus picks up. He said he was here to rescue the world and take it back from the rebels.
Which rebels? The human ones or the spiritual ones?
Exactly. For Jesus, it was all connected. When he marched into Jerusalem for Passover, he was announcing the ultimate exodus. He was there to confront and overcome all rebel powers and authorities, and he did it by giving up his life.
So this is what the Apostle Paul meant when he said that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities, triumphing over them by the cross.
Yes, Jesus condemned our evil by allowing the rebels to unleash all their hate and evil on him. But then he overcame it with the power of his love and resurrection life. And then Jesus told his followers that all authority in heaven and earth now belongs to him.
Now, the ultimate human and divine partner. This is really good news.
Yeah, and it's why the apostles started inviting everyone to give their allegiance to the risen Jesus, to discover freedom and a new way to be human.
Now, while Jesus gained a decisive victory over the rebel powers, He didn't destroy them. They're still around, causing problems.
Yes, and in fact, they are the problem. The apostles said that humanity's real enemy is never another human. Rather, it's the spiritual powers that animate our cultural idols that inspire hatred, division, and violence.
So when I see people hurting other people, behind it is the divine council gone rogue. How do you deal with this kind of enemy?
Well, the Apostle Paul said we can resist by putting on the character traits of Jesus like armor, faithfulness, justice, and peace. And he said that our only weapon is the Word of God. That is, the biblical story of good news that Jesus has overcome all rebels with the divine power of his life and love.
Okay, so that kind of took us summarizing the entire Old Testament narrative and on into the New Testament of what Jesus' ministry and strategy is about. But we're going to focus on the Tower of Babel today, get to, in the next couple of weeks, how the Old Testament looks back at Babel in different language they used to describe it, to get there and set that up. But that's a good summary version. Babel, however, is just 9 short verses in Genesis, where the author of this prologue, the first 11 verses of Genesis, chapters of Genesis, tells the story of how humanity is going to reach out to the celestial world and try to seek and offer themselves up to serve any and all of the gods that will come down and help them rebuild the world post-flood. There's all sorts of connections here back to the sons of God being reached out to out of Genesis 6, the Nephilim and the second rebellion here in the third rebellion. All sorts of very specific connections back to that. And through the connection of Nimrod, as that video pointed out, I think the Bible Project's right, Nimrod, who's connected to the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, he would be like the Nephilim post-flood, trying to actually rebuild the pre-Nephilim or the pre-flood Nephilim kingdom that existed, the one that God hated so much he destroyed the whole world. So we're going to try and bring that much together here this morning, starting with the narrative connections between chapter 10 and chapter 11. Chapter 10 was the Table of Nations that we looked at last week. And I told you, you cannot skip these things in the Bible, because if you do, you will fail to understand the narratives that are in and around them. And this is part of what I want you to see. So the story of Babel is sandwiched between the bloodline of Eber's 2 sons, Shem's bloodline in chapter 10 through Eber's son Joktan. Then you get the Tower of Babel, and then after the Tower of Babel, you get Shem's bloodline through Eber's son Peleg, who skipped in chapter 10, brought back to in chapter 11 after Babel. His name, Peleg, means divide. So these are connected narratives through genealogies with a story, a short story, jammed in between. The whole point is essentially to get us to Abraham's bloodline. Joktan's bloodline moves toward Babel in chapter 10, and in chapter 11, humans literally move eastward, which we'll talk about in a second. And then after Babel, Peleg's bloodline moves away from Babel because God literally calls Abram westward, away from Babel in Genesis 12. So what is being telecast here by this bloodline and ultimately tying the bloodlines to Abram, or Abraham as he'll later be renamed, is that Abraham is going to be the answer to Babel, to Genesis 6 with the rebellion of the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the loss of Eden. All 3 rebellions moving backwards in the prologue of Genesis. Abraham, when we get to chapter 12, he's the answer to what God is going to do to start to reverse that and rebuild Eden on earth. Now let's read this passage. It's 9 verses long, but we're only going to get to 4 verses today. We're going to focus on the human idea and desire in this passage. So, Genesis 11. Now the whole world had one language and one common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from over the face, over the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. Babel is this Hebrew word that sounds like confused. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. There's actually this fun Hebrew alliteration where if you're reading this in Hebrew, it's hard to say. It's designed to make you go blah 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 with your tongue and make it sound like you're just babbling, literally. So it's kind of an onomatopoeia in Hebrew. Anyways, I didn't realize that until I was translating it this week. Anyways, now verse 1 starts a new story. A new section of text is beginning. It's a post-flood repopulation narrative. Humanity is repopulating, multiplying again according to the blessings of the post-flood in Genesis 8 and 9. And they have one language and a common speech. Now, technically, this doesn't need to exactly mean there was one and only one language that existed at this time. It could refer to this idea of common speech as a lingua franca, as it gets called today, or just a common speech across people groups, across groups in multiple languages. There have been lots of lingua franca throughout history in different empires. Examples include Akkadian in ancient Mesopotamia. Akkadian was the common language across all Mesopotamia. It was a commerce language. You used it for trade. You used it for travel. If you were going to go anywhere in Mesopotamia, you pretty much had to know Akkadian. When Alexander conquers the known world and he builds his empire, he makes Greek the lingua franca of his day. So you were going to have your native language, but you were also going to learn Greek, because if you were going to go to the market and trade with people from the West, they were going to speak Greek, so you had to know Greek. Today, English is the lingua franca across the world. Most people have their native language and English. And we English speakers could really stand to benefit from the fact that most people throughout history didn't speak one language. They were at least bilingual. We're lazy. Because the lingua franca of our day is English, and that's our common language to speak with, we don't bother learning a second language. But it does a good job for your brain to learn to process everything twice in two different ways. And so bilingual people are often a lot smarter because they have to process everything twice in two different ways. Anyways, just thought I'd point that out. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there was one and only one. It at least means it was a lingua franca, though it could actually mean, okay, there was one and only one language at this time. I'm just pointing that out to you because you'll hear different interpretations, and they both have a basis in this text. Now, the people are moving eastward in verse 2. And moving eastward in Genesis is actually portrayed as moving away from God. It's not just in Genesis, it's throughout the Old Testament. It's a conceptual connection being made by the narrator that to move in a direction on a map is to move away from Yahweh's will, His presence, His life. And you should already have picked up on that picture because of stuff like Genesis 3:24. Adam and Eve move eastward after they rebel and are exiled. Cain in 4:16 dwells in the land east of Eden once he sins and is exiled. So he moves even further east than his parents did. 13:11, Lot will move toward the east in Canaan once he separates from Abram's group. This is not a reflection on Lot's character as it is for like Cain or Adam and Eve. It's simply putting him in the location of Sodom and foreshadowing Sodom's fate as being east of Abraham's group and Lot's needing to be rescued from that, because the Bible actually has a lot of positive things to say about Lot. Not only positive, he does. Anyways, well, I'm not even going to get into it. Other biblical non-Genesis things of moving east or west. This is a Genesis 1. Abraham has to leave Babylon in the east, and he has to move west into Canaan when God calls him. The tabernacle and the temple is constructed to face the east so that as a worshiper, you turn your back on the east and you move west in order to draw near to God, because you're essentially acting out through mimicking Abraham's call to leave Babylon, in the Mesopotamian cultures of that time. Judah is exiled by Babylon. They're taken to the east and they have to travel west in the post-exilic period to rebuild. So they kind of are the new Abraham post-exile as a group and a culture. This concept of moving east is implying a negative, and would make sense in Genesis 11 because where they ultimately decide to settle is the land of Shinar. Why is that important? Because, well, Shinar is the ancient designation for Babylon. It's already come up in chapter 10 in reference to Nimrod, whose original kingdoms were conquering in the land of Shinar. So he's already foreshadowed something in chapter 10. Don't skip those genealogies. Babylon is consistently portrayed as God's cosmic enemy throughout the Old Testament. They're not the only one. We talked about Assyria, also built by Nimrod after Babylon. But like this is going to be the story that sets up the reason. Why is Babylon God's cosmic enemies from Genesis through Revelation? This story is telling you primarily why. It's not that Shinar or Babylon's location matters. It's that Babylon sets the stage for paganism and calling out to gods and building a kingdom of imperial power based on pagan gods and paganism and pagan propaganda. And when God sets up his own kingdom, renewing Eden on earth, he says, I am staunchly against you and everything that you stand for. Right down to today. Now, verse 3, we get a new technology. The brick. It's a new invention. And suddenly, they can have large-scale construction projects. Now, Israel had an abundance of stone throughout their land. I mean, go to Israel today. Get off the bus as you're touring it around. There be rocks everywhere. There was this old rabbinic story that I learned afterwards, because I remember like walking around, there's just stone everywhere. I'm like, what is with all the stone? Is this just a rocky place? And somebody told me, it's like, there's an old apocryphal rabbinic tale that when God created the world, he gave a bag of rocks to an angel, and he says, okay, now go scatter this evenly throughout the world. And then as he was flying over Israel, the bag ripped and all of the stones fell out on Israel. And so it's like a funny story of trying to explain, yeah, Israel's got a lot of rocks. So they built based on stone. But when you're over in Mesopotamia, you're on a flat planed area. It's not very mountainy hill country. So you have to come up with a different way to build. They invented the brick. And what it was, it's mud on the inside, filling the shell on the outside. And verse 3 is trying to tell you they invented the brick, but you Israelites that I'm writing to don't understand what a brick is because you're used to building stone. So he gives you the explanation. They took it, they kind of formed it, and then they baked it until it became hard like a stone, and then they could build off of it. This picture I like because it's if you look closely, you can tell it's from Minecraft. Somebody built what we're going to talk about, the Tower of Babel actually being in Minecraft here. So they're capable of large-scale construction projects even without having to have a rock quarry or anything, you know. They're in a new location, and they can build in that new location with a new technology. Note the passage of time here in verses 2 and 3. None of this is happening right away. Humanity is multiplying again, so time is passing. Generations are being born, and those generations are inventing new technologies to meet their needs. And they're going to plan to use that technology together to do something. What are they going to do? Well, that's described for us in verse 4. And verse 4 is a summary. And this is as far as we're going to go in the text because we have to actually set our minds to the ancient Near Eastern idea. They say, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. That's all we're going to cover today, all right? The decision to become Nimrods. What did Nimrod mean? It meant rebel. Nimrod is a bad guy in chapter 10. Here, collectively, the people are being portrayed as rebels. So I'm calling humanity a bunch of Nimrods here for that purpose. Because they said, come, let's build a city for ourselves. Now, that's not so bad. In Genesis, a city is never really a positive thing. Who built the first city in the book of Genesis in chapter 4? You have to remember these plot points to tie these things together. Who built a city in chapter 4 after he was individually exiled for killing his brother? No, Abel died, so it was Cain, and he is ascribed building the first city that he named after his son Enoch, not the good Enoch that would come from Shem's line later, that would never die. Okay, so building a city is never exactly a positive thing, but it's not inherently bad, right? But together they're agreeing that they want to take this step to collectively do something, build a city. So there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but we should keep in mind that in Genesis, cities just are not painted in the best of light. Sodom and Gomorrah are going to come later. Babylon is the prototypical city that images God's enemies. All of this is inherent in the ancient world's mind. So Cain constructed the first city. He filled it with men like Lamech, who boasted of his murder of a young man to his multiple wives. So it's not inherently bad to build a city, but we should proceed with caution as we're reading this story because of how cities are perceived by the author of Genesis, especially in the prologue. After all, they're building a city. It's in the east, and it's in Shinar, which is Babylon. So already you've got 3 immediate strikes against you. If you're a good Hebrew and you're a good reader of the text, you're alerted to the fact that there's some trouble brewing here. And they're united in this decision. When they say, come, let us build a city, all of them together. There's not even a Noah-like character as in the second rebellion in chapter 6 to find favor in God's eyes. So, it's a city, and it's a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. So the primary point of building the city was that it would have a specific tower that reaches the skies above, the conceptual domain of the gods. That's important. You actually have to understand it with this interpretation. Because this is where interpreters and preachers immediately start going wrong in understanding the story. Failing to grasp what the tower was for the ancient Near Eastern mind, we later readers fill the details in with our own beliefs, our own presuppositions, and our own perceptions of what a tower would be there for. Everybody does this. If you don't know the answer to something, or if you can't clearly see what something is, your mind just fills it in with what you do know. We all do this. This is why, mermaids were invented, because they saw manatees out at sea and from a long distance, and they couldn't make out what they were. And so they started imagining, filling in what they did know, people and fish, blending them together. And humans do this. And even the best of intentioned preachers and teachers of the Bible do this. And so you have to work out how you're going to limit your ability to do this by actually putting it in its ancient Near Eastern context. And again, people usually consider the Tower of Babel to be a story about fallen humanity trying to work its way back to God or somehow get to heaven on its own terms, its own merits, our own works, our own strengths, and our own abilities. And Protestants, like us, are really bad at interpreting this story that way because we've descended our interpretations from guys like Luther, who were terrified of ever falling into a works righteousness motif or interpretation. They were vehemently trying to argue 500 years ago that you can't work your way to God. And so they interpret these stories to say, haha, see, humanity tried to work their way to God and it didn't work. But that's not what's going on in Babel. Our attempts fail because we're fallen, but the good news is that, and then we insert Jesus. Jesus met our needs and our inadequacies, and somehow, hey, we tried to build a tower, but God, man, He built a bridge with a cross, and that's how the Tower of Babel gets preached. And they tied in Jesus being sufficient to meet our needs, and this is the opposite of what the Tower of Babel actually is about. It's not the story of humanity trying to earn their way back to God or even to get into heaven or anything like that. It's the story of how humanity enticed the gods to come down to help them build their kingdom. And I'm going to go so far as to suggest that humanity is deliberately rejecting God's desire to rebuild Eden, the pre-flood Eden on earth, so that this group of humans can rebuild the pre-flood world of Genesis 6 and the Nephilim. The world that God hated so much that He destroyed the whole world. And in order to actually get to that interpretive end and to comprehend that interpretation as being accurate and correct, we need to understand what the Tower of Babel actually was. Because the word here, tower, migdal, in Hebrew, is just a very generic term. But what would it have been for an ancient Mesopotamian? Because this is where they're at in Shinar, Babylon, Mesopotamia. I've shown you pictures up to this point that are mostly like this, right? Some sort of artist renditioning of a tower. But what was the Tower of Babel? The Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. What is a ziggurat? Not this. This is a ziggurat. This is an artist rendering reconstructed of a ziggurat. This is a ziggurat. This is a reconstructed ziggurat of what's been uncovered and filled in. So, what is a ziggurat? At its most basic level, a ziggurat is a little mountain garden with a little tiny apartment on top with a giant staircase leading to the bottom for a god to use. A ziggurat was a man-made garden mountain structure built by an ancient Mesopotamia for the gods to come down to enter their temples at the bottom where humans could serve their needs and petition them to get their needs served before going back up the stairs to return to their own realm. So, what were ziggurats? Ziggurats were portals between heaven and earth. What was the Tower of Babel? It was designed to be a portal to help the gods come down to humans. It was created for the gods to come and go between the heavenly dwellings and their earthly temples, where they would get their needs met, like they'd get food in their temples. They would receive the animal sacrifices, they would accept human worship, and then they would grant human requests in their temples. A ziggurat is not a temple. A ziggurat is a gateway. They would descend the stairways, and the temples would be down at the bottom at the base of the ziggurat. Now, look at the handouts that I've given you. So this comes from the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. I believe John Walton, who's a noted Old Testament scholar, I think he's now retired, wrote this particular article. It's 2 pages. And then on the back, I've just given you a hard copy of a picture of the ziggurat from a different book. But I want to read this so that you understand something about where scholars are and why they think that this is just a ziggurat. Scholars are so convinced that this is a ziggurat, the Tower of Babel, that nobody even bothers arguing that it was a different structure at all. There was only so many structures that they actually had in the ancient world. So the numbers are limited. The research is so good here that I'm not even going to bother offering a second option for interpretation. It's a ziggurat or we don't know. But discovering its function and trying to understand its function based on what functions existed in buildings in the ancient world limits it to one and only one option, a ziggurat. And it's such a good interpretation of it, nobody even bothers offering a second one. And I just want to say, if somebody in the future, you're at a church and they say the Tower of Babel was something other than a ziggurat, you should ask them if they even know what a ziggurat was and what it was used for. And if they don't know what a ziggurat was, you need to actually go do the research and help them understand, because the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, and all Old Testament scholars worth their salt know that. And if they're not willing to say it and change their interpretation based on the gods trying to come down rather than us trying to go up, fire them. Fire them as a pastor, because they do not know enough to be a teacher or a preacher of the Word of God. This is basic Old Testament stuff. And all of the research points to this. This is a summary of the research, so I'm going to read this. Follow along with me. So, this article on ziggurats, short and sweet. Though they may resemble pyramids in appearance, ziggurats are nothing like them in function. Ziggurats have no inside. The structure was framed in mud brick, and then the core was packed with fill dirt. The facade was then completed with kiln fire brick. Ziggurats were dedicated to particular deities. Any given deity may have several ziggurats dedicated to them in different cities. Furthermore, a given city may have several ziggurats, though the main one was associated with the patron deity of the city. Archaeologists have discovered nearly 30 ziggurats in the general region, and the text mentions several others. The ancient Near Eastern text mentions several others that they haven't found or uncovered or that are no longer there. Back to the text. The main archaeological feature is the stairway or ramp that leads to the top. There was a small room at the top where a bed was made and a table set for the deity. Ziggurats range from in size from 60 feet per side to almost 200 feet per side. Most important is the function of the ziggurat. The ziggurat did not play a role in any of the rituals known to us from Mesopotamia. If known literature were our only guide, we would conclude that common people did not use the ziggurat for anything. It was sacred space and was strictly off limits to profane use. Though the structure at the top was designed to accommodate the god, it was not a temple where people would go to worship. In fact, the ziggurat was typically accompanied by an adjoining temple near its base where the worship did take place. The best indication of the function of the ziggurats comes from the names given to them. For instance, the name of the ziggurat at Babylon, Adamananke, means temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. One at Larsa means temple that links heaven and earth. Most significant is the name of the ziggurat at Sapar, temple of the stairway to pure heaven. The word translated stairway in this last example is used in the mythology as the means by which the messenger of the gods moved between heaven and earth and the netherworld. As the result of these data, we can conclude that the ziggurat was a structure built to support the stairway. This stairway was the visual representation of that which was believed to be used by the gods to travel from one realm to another. It was solely for the convenience of the gods and was maintained in order to provide the deity with amenities and make possible his descent to his temple. At the top of the ziggurat was the gate of the gods, the entrance into the heavenly abode. Adjoining the tower was the temple, where hopefully the god would descend to receive the gifts and worship of his people. In summary, the project is a temple complex featuring a ziggurat, which was designed to make it convenient for the god to come down to his temple, receive their worship, and bless his people. The key for understanding the Tower of Babel is to realize that the tower was not built so that people could ascend to heaven, but so that the deity could descend to earth. You should never again entertain the idea that the Tower of Babel story is about humanity trying to get to God. It is not. It never was. That is us reading it into the story. Humans did not go up and approach the ziggurat. This picture is misleading. This is a picture of a ziggurat, but there's all sorts of people on it. That is not what would happen. It was for the gods' use, so the only ones who were allowed to use it to come and go to their temple at the bottom were the gods. Think of it like a VIP entrance. The exception was that the priest would climb up and they would clean and manage the god's apartment. Some think that these separate stairways on the side, these smaller ones, were for the priest to go up. Alternatively, if different gods used the same ziggurat, like a father and a son gods, three of them descend, the father would have a main stairway and the little son gods, his sons, would use the separate stairways, or the priest would use them. It's unclear on those types of details, but it was only for the gods' use. And we should. Why should we accept the structure of the Tower of Babel? Because all of the best Old Testament scholars do. They do not even bother with a second interpretation or possibility. That it was this or it was nothing. Without using a specific word, the author of Genesis is portraying his intentions and his feelings about what humanity is collectively doing by building this well-known building. Humanity is collectively turning against God to seek the other gods to come down. What else could you call a ziggurat? As a ziggurat is a man-made garden mountain. So we're back to this motif of the garden mountain from Genesis 3. Heaven and earth were not thought to be separate realms. They overlapped. And the Bible Project video drew two circles, right? The human realm and the divine realm. And then the Tower of Babel, you saw them going up to try to ascend into that realm, but it wasn't for human use. It was to get the gods to come down. The conceptual idea of the place where heaven and earth overlapped, a garden mountain motif. It is a place where heaven and earth overlap, but it expresses two things. A mountain expresses remoteness, but a garden expresses plenty. So, mountains are remote places away from pesky and annoying humans. The gods lived in places considered uninhabitable to the ancient Near Eastern person, who lived mostly down in the lower plain area and regions. They did not live on the great, big, cosmic mountains. Gardens were places where there was always plenty of food, life-sustaining water, all that substance that beings need to live, humans and animals. So the gods would never lack that stuff. They were cosmic celebrities. They always have the best. So a ziggurat probably looked kind of more like this. Ignore the tiny people walking up there. That would not have been for their use, but this is a good portrayal of, having trees and stuff to make it look like a mountain. One, in its structure, but to make it look like a garden. Because that's where they show up. And all of this is in the Bible as the book in the place of Eden. God's garden mountain. Eden was the place where God originally intended heaven and earth to overlap. And that was a garden mountain. It was the garden mountain of God. It was where God lived on earth alongside his celestial and terrestrial family, who would come and go from that place. Together, as a single family and a single council, they met in God's house in Eden to administer his kingly reign throughout the land. Eden was lost. So with Eden lost, humanity creates their own mountain gardens. These cities constructed around temples, and more importantly, ziggurats that would connect heaven and earth, and the gods could come down to their temple. So, in summary, what was a ziggurat? It was a giant staircase with an apartment at the top. I mean, look at this picture. This is a good one. See, they go all the way up the stairs and down again, but only right up here is there really anything there. There might be some storehouses in some of these where they keep food and stuff, different things to make the bed of the gods in case he wanted to sleep there, stuff like that. But it was a little apartment with a staircase. It was a man-made mountain garden in conception. It was created from their invention of the brick. I mean, all of these plot points are being tied here together, and the author of Genesis is giving you the details so that you could not miss this. It served as a portal between heaven and earth for the gods to use to get to and from their temples with easy access. Humans did not use them. Temples were next to them for normal use with human worship. So, for the ancient Near Eastern reader, the idea that they built a ziggurat would have been impossible to miss. Yes, it just uses a common term for a big tower, a migdal, in Hebrew, but the ancient Near Eastern readers, they didn't need a lot of information. And this prologue is designed to be a densely packed and informative story, or multiple short stories, telling you a lot with very little words. We don't exist in that world, and we don't understand what these words are meaning because we don't conceptualize these things in our minds. We conceptualize a tower and we think, oh, they're trying to get to heaven. They conceptualize a tower and designed for a purpose, and they would understand it to get the gods to come down automatically, which boils it down to one option, a ziggurat. It represented a Genesis 3-like attempt to set up an Eden on earth on man's terms. It was a place where the gods and humans could meet and build the new kingdom. Once the gods come down to the temple, the city would now be the place built around the gods. And the ziggurat temple in the complex in the center of the city was the main attraction to get the gods to come down. So how does this change our interpretation of Genesis 11? This is about all we'll have time for today, so we'll pick it up here. At the most fundamental level, what we're supposed to understand is that humans weren't trying to get to God. What were they trying to do? They were trying to get the gods to come down to them. And that is a very different story and interpretation from what most of us have been taught about the tower. Next week, we'll cover what exactly they thought they were doing. And this is where we're going with it, as I've already said, but we didn't have time to get to it today. They're trying to rebuild the pre-flood Nephilim-driven kingdom. That's what they want to do. And there are hints to this, more than hints, if you know the previous stories and you're reading the language here, There are hints to this that are connected all the way back from Genesis 6. 6:4 gets repeated in chapter 10 and here in chapter 11. And if we know what we're picking up on in previous stories, we know that the author is bringing these plot points together without repeating every little detail over again. He uses some subtle ideas, but it's pretty clear once you pick up on the fact that they're not trying to get up there, they're trying to bring it down here, why they would want to do that, based on their own words in verse 4. Let's make a name for ourselves, and what that connects to from the second rebellion of the sons of God in the Genesis 6 and the prologue to the flood. And the scattering of the people in the Tower of Babel is about God keeping his covenant promise to Noah not to flood the world again. Because if they're trying to rebuild the pre-flood world and God said, I'll never again flood the world, God has to come up with a different judgment. Because he promised he wouldn't destroy humanity again. Even if they rebuilt exactly what he destroyed them for in the beginning to begin with, he will come up with a different way to judge them. So that's where we're going.